Welcome to Superhero Rundown. I'm Crimson, and we're talking about Hugo Weaving being awesome, V for Vendetta, and Anarchy. V for Vendetta is a 2005 dystopian political action film starring Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman. But we aren't here for the plot. We're never here for the plot. That's not what this show is about. We arrive in a dystopia in 2027, which yikes, because that's not that far in the future, and a second civil war is raging in America, a plague is devastating Europe, and a fascist government has decided to be the worst in Britain. Joshua Rivera outlines our setting in V for Vendetta, knew our future would be a bleak one. In V for Vendetta, a lot has gone wrong very quickly, and it doesn't seem like there's much to be done about it. The film is set in the late 2020s, and London is now under the authoritarian rule of the fascist High Chancellor Fidler, the leader of the extremely Nazi-looking Northfire Party. The parallels to real-world 2020 are alarming. The St. Mary's virus has unleashed a pandemic on the world, crippling the United States, which doesn't really factor into the film's London-centric plot, and sending it on a path to economic ruination and civil war. The Northfire Party, which rode in on a wave of neoconservative support, locks up gay citizens, anyone who practices a religion other than the state-sanctioned church, and is supported by state-run media. Surveillance is almost casual, with government vans regularly sweeping the streets to listen in on citizens. If that's what we're headed for, I'd like to get off the ride, please. For now, let's talk about V. V is introduced by saving Evie, played by Natalie Portman, and dies within the span of the film. He proclaims that there is something wrong with the country, and people actually repeat that thread as they discover the sinister secrets of the fascist leader of Britain, Chancellor Fidler, played by John Hurt.
And the truth is, there is something terribly wrong with this country, isn't there?
V says he didn't steal his artifacts in his home, but he took it back from the Ministry of Objectionable Materials. He imprisons and tortures Evie. He falls in love with her, but ends up dying, saving the country from a corrupt government. The juxtaposition of Evie and V's freedom from fear scenes are actually wonderful to watch. And remember, V is what we would call a bandit hero, specifically according to Nicholas A. Curott and Alexander Fink in Bandit Heroes Social, Mythical, or Rational. While social bandits are considered criminals in the eyes of the elites, they are admired by the members of the exploited peasant classes from which they come. Social banditry, in contrast to ordinary banditry, according to Eric Hobsbawm, is characterized by a supportive relationship between the peasant population and the bandits. The unique social bond formed between the bandits and the peasants sometimes plants the seeds of more substantial peasant resistance against the oppression of the ruling classes. And he's not exactly a person, so you can't say if he's a good man or not. The film is very explicit in its portrayal of V as the embodiment of an idea rather than as an individual. We don't even see his face. It's always obscured in some way.
Ideas are bulletproof.
Let's talk about Fidler, V's counterpart. He's supposed to be a fascist leader, but you don't see him physically until the end of the film, where he has been beaten. Throughout the film, he appears on closed-circuit television to his cronies and his citizens, and is meant to represent the very antithesis of what V is. Like his real-world counterpart, Fidler is given to hysterical speech patterns and is a racial purist, having his secret police hunt down opponents, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, atheists, homosexuals, and other undesirables, which are then imprisoned or executed. Well, I'm for of those. The party of the country, Northfire, is reminiscent of its real-life counterpart, with propaganda, persecution, and a focus on what is considered acceptable in society. Now, the original story by Alan Moore was supposed to be a response to Thatcherism in the early 1980s and was set as a conflict between a fascist state and anarchism. Obviously, the film was changed by the Wachowskis, but Moore has accused them of abandoning the original themes by focusing on a modern U.S. political context. Obviously, a film can't really portray a bunch of well-rounded, real people who are fascists like a graphic novel can. I understand Moore's criticisms, but I also understand that you can't tell a story like V for Vendetta as well as the author. Looking at you, HBO. Which brings us to Anarchy. Full disclosure, I am an anarchist. Die mad about it, nerds. Now, I usually identify with open source anarchy. I'll have David P. Fidler explain. One of the most important concepts in international relations theory is anarchy. In fact, international relations theory contains diverse attempts to come to grips with the problem and potential of anarchy as the environment in which states and non-state actors interact. Two leading theories, realism and institutionalism, explain anarchy by focusing on the interactions of states, and these theories discount or dismiss non-state actors as factors in state-centric anarchical politics. Other theories, namely liberalism and constructivism, create space for non-state actors to influence anarchical politics. But open source anarchy is a little bit different. The concept of open source anarchy attempts to communicate that the leading theories of international relations described above do not adequately explain the condition of anarchy in international relations in the early 21st century. The concept borrows from the open source software movement, which involves people accessing, modifying, and disseminating software source code in an effort to make the software operate better. The analogy is not comprehensive because, as analyzed later in the paper, aspects of open source anarchy do not necessarily produce iteratively better international relations. The key part of the analogy is the open source idea. The theory of open source anarchy posits that anarchy, as the defining feature of international relations, has become directly accessible to non-state actors as never before. This direct access has features and consequences for world politics that none of the leading theories of international relations explain well. You know, like through academic articles and YouTube videos where a gender fluid person talks about superheroes on the internet. But David goes further, explaining the importance of realizing why open source anarchy is the way of the future. In open source anarchy, the ability of non-state actors to affect international relations can also create opportunities for states to compete in more traditional ways. As the United States has experienced greater difficulties in fighting the global war on terrorism, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq, the emergence of open source anarchy does not mean that states cease their competition with each other. Russia, China, India, North Korea, and Iran have all attempted to take advantage of the perceived weakening of U.S. power, influence, and credibility to enhance their respective positions. So with anarchy, you can do a lot, including forcing states to compete in more traditional ways, which is why V succeeds by the end of the film. He uses explosives and the truth to achieve his ends. While the former is not in short supply, the latter is often obscured for political benefit by both sides of the aisle in the United States. Oh, and for the record, Democrats are moderate conservatives at best. Okay, now that you are fully convinced by just that one sentence, let's talk about the importance of the mask in V for Vendetta. In Masked Protest in the Age of Austerity, Jennifer B. Spiegel explains, in the media and amongst police spokespeople and politicians, masks became associated with perpetrators of unregulated violence. In a bid to defend such preemptive legislation, the head of Montreal's police union appealed to the ubiquitous good protester, bad protester divide. The objective for us is to catch these troublemakers before the situation spirals out of control so that others, including families with children, can protest in peace and security. The justification offered by Montreal's mayor, Gerald Tremblay, when your cause is just and your intentions are good, why hide your face or refuse to give your itinerary to police? The wearing of masks became not only symbolically associated with criminal behavior, but a crime in itself. Such criminalization could only be justified on preemptive grounds because other criminal acts with which the mask became associated were already enshrined in the criminal code. Those accused of such crimes, for example breaking windows, could already be arrested and prosecuted. What was criminalized then was not the obscuring of identity while committing a crime, but simply the obscuring of personal identity in itself. Spiegel goes further, though. When one is silenced by fear for one's life or bodily safety, or fear of incarceration or sanction that would prevent one from pursuing a livelihood, there can be no political discussion. The mask, in its original meaning as persona, is thus paradoxically the precondition for public engagement, whereas a body, or even a face in its purely personal incarnation, the face or role one puts forward shapes political agency. The wearing of a mask obscures the public persona of the individual in the contemporary sense, but it also reinvents it. It replaces the individuality or the individuality of the person with the person who is at once corporeal and vulnerable on one hand, and collective, public, and able to carry the power of ideas that transcend the individual on the other. The mask thus recreates a future public persona through which to intervene in the social and political dynamics that circumscribe existing possibilities. And that's why V is so important in the film. It's not him specifically, but what he represents. Evie tells the detective that he was all of us.
Ideas are bulletproof.
A lot of articles have come out recently about how V for Vendetta was predictory or some nonsense like that. But if you study people long enough, it's where we've been headed for a long time. I don't think it's really a prediction of the future, as it is a cautionary tale to not get complacent. Ethan Sachs, in his article for NBC News, writes, "Either way, the real-life developments of 2020 are proving uncomfortably familiar to many creators of dystopian science fiction. The genre has been a popular form of catharsis for audiences slogging through their present existences since before H.G. Wells tinkered with the time machine at the end of the 19th century. Written 35 years before its title, George Orwell's 1984 posited a totalitarian world full of mass surveillance that already bore a resemblance to Stalinist Russia of his era. In recent decades, movies have also plumbed our fears of a future in which humanity has been devastated by overpopulation, societal collapse, technology run amok, and a turn to authoritarianism. For the most part, though, those cinematic visions of a post-apocalyptic future have been more about popcorn than the kernels of truth. And in the pages of books like Cormac McCarthy's The Road and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, the dark visions laid out for the future seems years away at worst. Then the calendar turned to 2020. We've had a lot of dark media portrayals in the last 50 years. Not because they're predictory, but because they're supposed to be a cautionary tale. V for Vendetta is an excellent film, not just because of the cinematography and the acting, but because of the message it tells us. And it's not just that. The film also uses a lot of Shakespeare throughout. Moreover, as in most revenge tragedies, the protagonist's use of violent intrigue to pursue his retribution threatens to lower him to the moral level of his enemies, and he must pay for his revenge with his own death. V ultimately achieves his vengeance against the fascist dictator Adam Sutler, but his victory comes at the cost of many lives, both innocent and guilty, and V himself does not survive to savor his triumph. It would easily be possible in the early 21st century to condemn V, as Sutler does, as a violent terrorist. However, the film uses Shakespeare allusions to indicate V's function as the hero, a revenge play, who achieves tragic status himself for his cause and ridding the nation of a corrupt ruling class. Aligning V with Shakespeare makes this film's title character look less like Osama bin Laden and more like Hamlet, who nobly avenges the death of his father, burning in Catholic purgatory, and thereby sets the state of Denmark right. Remember, the 5th of November is not just a nursery rhyme, but a call to action. Be like V, because if you can make the idea bulletproof, you will not have died in vain.